Before we proceed, I want to give this disclaimer. This video provides an academic and historical analysis of philosophical ideas that have profoundly impacted human history. This content is designed strictly for educational and documentary purposes to explore the evolution of human thought. I am not endorsing any of them. The goal here is to understand them, because ideas you don't understand are the ones most likely to control you.
Plato didn't just tolerate deception. He built it into his blueprint for the ideal society. In the Republic, he introduces what he calls the noble lie, and the name alone should make you uncomfortable. Because when someone puts the word noble in front of lie, they're not being honest about honesty. They're dressing up manipulation in a philosopher's robes. Here's what Plato proposes. The rulers of his ideal state, the philosopher kings, should tell the citizens a myth, a fabricated story, that every person is born from the earth itself, and that the gods mixed different metals into their souls: gold for the rulers, silver for the warriors, bronze and iron for the laborers and farmers. And this myth, this carefully constructed fiction, would explain to every citizen why they belong exactly where they are in the social hierarchy, not because of politics, not because of power, but because of their very nature. That's the lie. You are made for your station in life, and questioning it would be questioning the gods themselves. Now, Plato argues this isn't malicious. He sees it as a stabilizing force, a way to prevent civil unrest, to keep society functioning smoothly. In his view, most people can't handle the full truth about justice, governance, and the nature of reality. So you give them a story they can digest, a story that keeps them cooperative, content, obedient.
And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because Plato isn't proposing a one-time deception. He's proposing a system of deception, institutionalized, generational, baked into the very foundation of the state. The lie isn't just told once. It's taught, repeated, reinforced, until it becomes indistinguishable from truth, until the people who believe it can't even recognize it as a lie anymore. Sound familiar? It should.
Every authoritarian regime has operated on some version of this principle: the divine right of kings, racial hierarchies, caste systems, the idea that some people are simply born to lead and others are born to serve. Plato didn't invent propaganda, but he gave it philosophical legitimacy. He made it respectable. And here's the part that cuts deepest. Plato genuinely believes this is for the people's own good. He argues that the masses are too irrational, too driven by appetite and emotion to govern themselves, or even to understand why they're governed the way they are. So the enlightened few must manage them, guide them, and, yes, deceive them, for their benefit, of course. That's the logic of every tyrant who ever lived. I know better. Trust me. Don't ask questions. But Plato takes it a step further. He doesn't just say rulers can lie. He says they should, that it's a duty, a responsibility of leadership. The noble lie isn't a last resort in his framework. It's a first principle.
And that's the real danger here. Not just the lie itself, but the precedent it sets. The idea that truth is a luxury, that it's something to be rationed, distributed only to those deemed worthy of it, that the average person doesn't deserve to know the real reasons behind the structures that govern their life.
Plato opens the door to something no society should ever normalize: the idea that those in power have a right to control what people believe, not through argument, not through evidence, through myth, through design. He calls it noble. History calls it something else entirely. Niccolo Machiavelli didn't invent political cruelty, but he did something arguably worse. He gave it a manual. Before Machiavelli, Political philosophy at least pretended to care about virtue. Plato wanted philosopher kings. Aristotle talked about the common good. Even the most ruthless rulers of the ancient world felt the need to drape their ambitions in the language of justice. There was a mask, and that mask, however thin, still mattered because it meant that cruelty had to justify itself. It had to answer to something higher. Machiavelli ripped that mask off. In The Prince, written in 1513, he argues plainly, without apology, that a ruler's only real concern should be the acquisition and maintenance of power, not justice, not the good of the people, not God's will, power. And whatever it takes to hold on to it, that's fair game. He tells rulers it is better to be feared than loved. He advises them to break promises when keeping them works against their interest. He openly recommends deception, manipulation, and, when necessary, violence, not as a last resort, as a strategy. And here's what makes it so dangerous. Machiavelli wasn't writing this as a villain. He wasn't cackling in a dark room. He was being pragmatic. He looked at the world as it actually was, full of treachery, ambition, and backstabbing, and he said, essentially, stop pretending. Stop clinging to ideals that will get you destroyed. Play the game, or the game plays you. That's the seduction of it. He frames ruthlessness as realism. He makes cruelty sound like common sense. And the consequences? They've echoed through centuries. Every dictator, every authoritarian, every political operator who's justified their actions with, "That's just how the world works," they're borrowing from Machiavelli's Playbook, whether they've read him or not. Because what Machiavelli really did was separate politics from morality completely, cleanly, permanently. He didn't just say that bad things happen in politics. Everyone knew that. He said bad things should happen in politics, that morality is a handicap, that ethics are for philosophers, not for people who actually want to win. And once you separate power from ethics, you don't get better rulers. You get rulers who feel no obligation to be better. You get a political culture where lying isn't a failure, it's a skill, where cruelty isn't a sin, it's a tool. Now, some defenders of Machiavelli argue he was simply being honest, that he was describing reality, not endorsing it, and there's some truth to that reading. But here's the problem. When you write a how-to guide for tyranny, it doesn't really matter what your intentions were. The book exists, the ideas are out there, and the people who picked it up, they didn't read it as a cautionary tale. They read it as instructions. Napoleon reportedly kept a copy of The Prince at his bedside. Mussolini called it a guide for statesmen. Stalin studied it. The book wasn't just read by philosophers, it was read by men with armies. That's the danger Machiavelli unleashed. Not that he made tyrants possible, they existed long before him, but that he made tyranny intellectually respectable. He gave it a framework, a logic, a vocabulary. And that vocabulary is still in use today. Every time someone says the ends justify the means, they're speaking Machiavelli's language, whether they know it or not. He didn't just describe a world without morals, he helped build one. Thomas Hobbes looked at humanity and saw something most people don't want to admit. He saw chaos. Not potential, not goodness waiting to bloom, chaos. His masterwork, Leviathan, published in 1651, lays it out with uncomfortable clarity. Hobbes argues that human beings, left to their own devices, without law, without government, without some force standing over them, will tear each other apart. Not because they're evil, but because they're competitive, suspicious, and desperate for survival. That's the natural state of man, according to Hobbes. A war of all against all, every person a threat to every other person. No trust, no cooperation, just raw, relentless self-interest. And he doesn't flinch from the implications. Hobbes describes life in this state of nature with one of the most famous lines in the history of political philosophy: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's not poetry, that's a diagnosis. He's saying, this is what you get without order. This is the default. And if you think people will just naturally figure it out, build communities, treat each other fairly, Hobbes says you're dreaming. So what's the solution? Here's where it gets dangerous. Hobbes argues that the only way out of this nightmare is to surrender. Not partially, not conditionally, completely. He proposes that people must hand over their individual rights and freedoms to a single absolute sovereign, a ruler or governing body with unchecked power. This is what he calls the social contract. You give up your freedom, in return, you get order, you get safety, you get to live. But the cost? The sovereign answers to no one. There are no checks, no balances, no appeals. Hobbes is explicit about this. The sovereign's authority must be absolute, because any limitation on that authority opens the door back to chaos. The moment you allow dissent, the moment you let people question the ruler's legitimacy, you're one step away from collapse. That's his logic. And it's airtight if you accept the premise. And that's the problem, because Hobbes' argument has been used again and again to justify the very thing it claims to prevent: violence. Authoritarians throughout history have leaned on this logic, the idea that people can't be trusted, that freedom leads to disorder, that the only real stability comes from control, total, unchallengeable control. Every dictator who ever crushed a protest, silenced a critic, or dissolved a parliament has echoed some version of Hobbes' reasoning. Maybe not by name, but the DNA is there. Now, to be fair, Hobbes wasn't writing in a vacuum. He lived through the English Civil War. He saw what happens when political order collapses: the bloodshed, the instability, the fear. His philosophy was born out of that fear. And in that context, his argument makes a certain kind of sense. He wasn't cheering for tyranny, he was terrified of anarchy. But that doesn't make the idea less dangerous, because once you accept the premise that people need to be controlled, that freedom is the problem, not the solution, you've opened a door that's very hard to close. Hobbes gave future generations a sophisticated, intellectually rigorous framework for crushing liberty in the name of security. And the worst part? It sounds reasonable. It sounds like common sense. People need strong leadership. Too much freedom breeds chaos. You've heard these lines before. You've probably nodded along at some point. That's what makes Hobbes so dangerous. Not that he was wrong about everything, but that he was right about just enough to make the rest of it convincing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had one of the most seductive ideas in the history of philosophy, and it got people killed. Here's what he argued: human beings are naturally good, innocent even. It's society, its institutions, its hierarchies, its private property that corrupts them. Strip all of that away, and you get back to something pure, something noble. Rousseau called this the state of nature, a condition where people lived free, uncorrupted, whole. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? That's the problem, because Rousseau didn't stop there. In his work, The Social Contract, he introduced a concept that would reshape and destabilize the political landscape of Europe. He called it the general will. The idea that there exists a collective will of the people, and that this will is always right, always aimed at the common good. Not the will of the majority, mind you, not a vote count, the general will. Something deeper, something almost mystical. And here's where it gets dangerous. Rousseau argued that if an individual's personal desires conflict with the general will, that individual is essentially wrong, mistaken about their own freedom. And so, and this is a direct quote, they must be forced to be free.
Sit with that for a moment. Forced to be free. That's not a contradiction to Rousseau. It's the logical endpoint of his thinking. If the general will represents true freedom, then anyone who resists it is resisting their own liberation. They don't need persuasion. They need correction. Now, who gets to define this general will? Who decides what the common good actually looks like? Rousseau never really answered that clearly, and that silence, that gap, became an open door for the worst kind of political actors to walk through. Enter the French Revolution. Robespierre didn't just admire Rousseau, he worshipped him, carried his ideas like scripture. And when Robespierre rose to power during the Reign of Terror, he wielded Rousseau's philosophy like a blade. Dissent wasn't just disagreement, it was a betrayal of the general will. And betrayal of the general will, that was a crime against the people themselves. The absolute, unshakable certainty that the revolution embodied the general will, and anyone standing in its way was an enemy of freedom itself. Thousands were executed, not in spite of Rousseau's ideals, but in their name. That's the thing about Rousseau's philosophy. It starts with empathy, with a genuine concern for inequality, for suffering, for the way institutions crush ordinary people. And none of that is wrong. But the framework he built around those concerns, the idea that society can be remade from scratch, that human nature is a blank canvas smeared by civilization, that there exists one true will of the people, that framework is a loaded weapon. Because the moment you believe people are naturally good and only corrupted by systems, you stop seeing individuals. You start seeing obstacles. Anyone who disagrees with the program isn't a person with a different perspective. They're a product of corruption, and corruption must be purged. Rousseau didn't intend any of this. He never called for mass executions. He probably would have been horrified. But that's the nature of dangerous ideas. They don't need the philosopher's permission to do damage. They just need someone desperate enough to take them to their logical conclusion. And someone always is. Rousseau gave the world a vision of human goodness, but he also handed it a justification for tyranny dressed in the language of liberation, and history accepted both. There's a philosophy that reduces morality to arithmetic, and it's one of the most influential ethical frameworks ever constructed. It's called utilitarianism. Its core claim is deceptively simple. The right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Jeremy Bentham, the father of this idea, didn't just suggest it, he formalized it. He developed what he called the philosophic calculus, a literal equation for moral decision-making. You measure the pleasure an action produces, subtract the pain, and whatever yields the highest net happiness, that's the moral choice. Sounds reasonable, almost scientific, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because here's what the math demands. If sacrificing one innocent person saves 5, you sacrifice the one. If starving a village feeds a city, you starve the village. The numbers don't care about the individual. The equation doesn't have a column for dignity. And this isn't hypothetical. This logic has been deployed again and again to justify some of history's worst decisions. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, defended with utilitarian reasoning, kill hundreds of thousands now to save millions in a prolonged war. Forced sterilization programs in the early 20th century, justified by the greater good of public health and genetic fitness. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, rationalized as a necessary security measure for the majority. Colonial exploitation across continents, framed as spreading civilization to the many, even if it meant crushing the few underfoot. The calculus always works out if you're the one doing the math and not the one being subtracted. Now, John Stuart Mill tried to refine this.
He argued that not all pleasures are equal, that intellectual and moral pleasures are higher than mere physical satisfaction. He wanted utilitarianism to be more nuanced, more humane. But Mill never solved the core problem, because at the end of the day, his version still says the same thing. If the outcome is good enough, the sacrifice is justified. And that's the trap. Utilitarianism gives you a clean conscience while doing terrible things. It wraps cruelty in rationality. It tells you that suffering is acceptable, necessary even, as long as the spreadsheet balances out. Think about the trolley problem for a moment. It's become almost a cliché in philosophy classes, but it exists because of this exact tension. A trolley is heading toward 5 people. You can pull a lever to divert it, but doing so kills one person on the other track. Most people say pull the lever, but now change the scenario. You're standing on a bridge. You can push a large man off the edge to stop the trolley and save the 5. Same math, same outcome, but suddenly it feels monstrous.
Why? Because human beings aren't numbers, and deep down, we know it. But utilitarianism says we're wrong to feel that way. It says our moral intuitions are irrational noise, that the math should override the gut. And that's precisely the danger that Immanuel Kant identified. Kant argued that human beings are ends in themselves, never merely means to someone else's outcome. You don't get to use a person as a tool, no matter how many lives you think it saves. Dignity, in Kant's framework, is non-negotiable.
But utilitarianism has no room for non-negotiable. Everything is on the table. Every life, every right, every principle, if the numbers are big enough. So the next time someone tells you a decision is for the greater good, pay close attention, because that phrase has justified more atrocities than almost any other in human history. The equation doesn't protect you, it calculates you.
George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel had an idea so seductive, so intoxicating, that it didn't just influence philosophy, it rewrote the political playbook for the next 2 centuries, and most people have never even heard of it. Here it is. Hegel argued that history isn't random, it isn't chaos, it isn't just one thing happening after another. No, he claimed history has a direction, a purpose, a logic. He called it the dialectic, this process where one idea, a thesis, inevitably generates its opposite, an antithesis, and from their collision, something new emerges, a synthesis. Then that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the whole thing starts again, over and over, grinding forward. But forward toward what? Hegel's answer? Toward the full realization of freedom, toward what he called the absolute, the moment when spirit, or Geist, finally knows itself completely. He saw all of human history, every war, every revolution, every empire rising and falling, as spirit working itself out, becoming conscious of itself through us, through nations, through struggle. And right there, that's where the danger starts. Because if history has a direction, then it has a right side. And if it has a right side, then anything done in service of that direction can be justified. Every act of violence, every crushed rebellion, every purge, it all becomes acceptable, necessary even, just the dialectic doing its work. Hegel himself made this disturbingly clear. He argued that the state, not the individual, is the highest expression of ethical life. He called the state the march of God through the world. Not a metaphor, not poetry. He meant it. The state, in Hegel's framework, is where freedom actualizes itself. The individual, a vessel, a footnote. You don't matter except insofar as you serve the unfolding of history. And the so-called world historical individuals, figures like Napoleon, Alexander, Caesar, Hegel saw them as agents of the world spirit. They didn't know they were instruments. They thought they were acting on ambition, on personal desire. But really, Hegel argued, history was using them, moving through them. And when they'd served their purpose, history discarded them. That was fine in Hegel's view. That was the plan. Now, think about what happens when a political movement picks up this framework. Marx did exactly that. He took Hegel's dialectic, flipped it on its head, replaced spirit with material conditions, and used it to argue that communism was the inevitable end of history. Not a hope, not a goal, an inevitability. And if it's inevitable, then anyone standing in its way isn't just wrong. They're standing against the tide of history itself. That logic gave ideological cover to some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Millions dead. Not despite the philosophy, because of it. But it wasn't just Marx. Right-wing Hegelians used the same framework to glorify the state, to argue that the nation embodies the will of history. Fascism drank from this well too. Different conclusions, same poisoned source. And here's the part that doesn't get said enough. Hegel's idea is dangerous not because it's obviously wrong. It's dangerous because it feels profound. It gives suffering a narrative. It turns horror into progress. It tells you that the bloodshed wasn't meaningless. It was necessary. And that's exactly the kind of story people want to believe. The moment you accept that history has a script, you stop questioning the people who claim to be reading it. That's the trap. And Hegel built the door. Three words. That's all it took. God is dead. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote those words in 1882 in The Gay Science, and they detonated like a bomb across the entire landscape of Western thought. Not quietly, not politely. They ripped through centuries of moral certainty and left behind a void. But here's what most people get wrong about Nietzsche. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't throwing a party. He wasn't some smug atheist standing on a soapbox celebrating the end of religion. That's the popular image, and it's dead wrong. Nietzsche puts these words in the mouth of a madman, a man running through the marketplace with a lantern in broad daylight, screaming at people who don't even believe in God anymore. And the madman isn't triumphant. He's horrified. He's asking the real question, the one nobody wanted to face. If God is dead, then what happens to everything that was built on top of him? Morality, meaning, purpose, truth itself. Nietzsche understood something that his readers, then and now, often refuse to accept. God wasn't just a religious idea. God was the foundation, the bedrock beneath Western civilization's entire moral architecture. Right and wrong, good and evil, the dignity of the individual, the belief that life has inherent meaning, all of it rested on a theological foundation. And Nietzsche argued that once you pull that foundation out, the whole structure doesn't just wobble, it collapses. And that's the dangerous part, not the claim itself, the aftermath. Nietzsche warns that the death of God creates a crisis unlike anything humanity has faced before. He calls it the greatest event in recent history. Not because it's liberating, because it's catastrophic. Without a universal moral framework, without a shared sense of meaning, human beings are left staring into an abyss. And most of them, he argues, aren't strong enough to handle it. So what fills the vacuum? That's where it gets dark. Nietzsche predicts, and this is chilling when you read it in hindsight, that the 20th century would be defined by ideological warfare, by mass movements, by people desperately searching for something, anything, to replace what was lost. Nationalism, communism, fascism, all of them, in their own twisted way, attempts to fill the God-shaped hole in civilization's chest. He wasn't wrong. The 20th century delivered exactly what Nietzsche feared. Totalitarian regimes rose not in spite of the collapse of religious morality, but because of it. When you remove the old gods, new ones rush in, and the new ones don't ask for prayers. They demand obedience, absolute, unquestioning obedience. And Nietzsche saw this coming. He didn't just diagnose the problem, he agonized over it. His concept of the Übermensch, the overman, was his desperate attempt at a solution, a human being strong enough to create their own values, their own meaning, without leaning on religion or ideology. But even Nietzsche himself seemed uncertain whether this was realistic, whether ordinary people could bear that kind of weight. Most can't. That's not cynicism, that's observation. So when people casually quote "God is dead" at dinner parties or slap it on a t-shirt, they're missing the point entirely. Nietzsche wasn't delivering a punchline. He was issuing a warning that the collapse of shared moral foundations doesn't lead to freedom, it leads to chaos, to madness, to the kind of ideological possession that turned the 20th century into a graveyard. 3 words, and the world still hasn't recovered from them. Karl Marx didn't pull a trigger. He wrote a book, and that book has a body count that rivals any weapon ever invented. Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto aren't just political texts, they're blueprints. Marx lays out a vision of history as one long, brutal class war, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the owners against the workers. And his conclusion isn't reform, it isn't negotiation, it's revolution. Violent, total, irreversible revolution. Marx argues that capitalism isn't just flawed, it's a system of organized theft. The worker produces value, the owner takes it. That's exploitation in his framework. Not a bug in the system itself. And the only way to end it, Marx insists, is to destroy the system entirely, dismantle private property, abolish class distinctions, seize the means of production, hand everything to the collective. On paper, it sounds like justice. In practice, it became a machine for mass suffering. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, Cuba, North Korea, every regime that took Marx's ideas and ran with them ended up in the same place. Centralized power, crushed dissent, and millions of dead bodies. Stalin's purges, Mao's Great Leap Forward, Pol Pot's killing fields. Conservative estimates put the death toll of communist regimes in the 20th century somewhere around 100 million people. That's not a rounding error. That's a continent's worth of graves. Now, Marx's defenders will say that's not what he meant, that these regimes distorted his ideas, corrupted them, that real communism has never been tried. And there's a grain of truth in that. Marx himself might have been horrified by what Stalin did in his name. But here's the problem, and it's a problem Marx never solves. He calls for the dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional phase where the working class holds absolute power to reshape society before the state eventually withers away. That's his phrase, withers away. As if power has ever, in the entire history of civilization, voluntarily dissolved itself. It doesn't. It never has. And Marx gives no mechanism, none, for how this transition is supposed to happen peacefully. He provides the justification for seizing power. He provides nothing for giving it back. That's the fatal flaw, not just in the implementation, in the idea itself. Marx treats the state as a tool. Use it to crush the old order, then set it aside. But tools like that don't get set aside. They get wielded by people who have no intention of letting go, every single time. And there's something else, something deeper. Marx's framework demands that you see the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed. That's it. 2 categories. If you're not one, you're the other. There's no room for nuance, no room for complexity, No room for the possibility that human societies are messy, layered, contradictory things that don't reduce neatly into binary conflict. That binary thinking, that you're either with the revolution or you're the enemy, is what turns ideology into atrocity. Because once you define an entire class of people as oppressors, you've already dehumanized them. And dehumanization is the first step toward elimination, every time. Marx wanted to liberate the worker. That was his stated goal. But the ideas he left behind became the intellectual scaffolding for some of the worst horrors the modern world has ever seen. He lit the fuse, others pulled the trigger, but the gunpowder, that was all his. Most people treat democracy like it's sacred, like it's the natural endpoint of political progress. Challenge it, and you're immediately suspicious, dangerous even. Plato challenged it over 2,000 years ago, and his critique is still one of the most uncomfortable arguments in the history of political thought. In the Republic, Plato doesn't just criticize democracy. He ranks it near the bottom of political systems, just one step above tyranny. And he doesn't do it casually. He builds a detailed, ruthless case for why rule by the people is, in his view, a recipe for disaster. His core argument? Simple, brutal. Most people don't know what they're doing. Plato compares democratic society to a ship. You wouldn't let passengers vote on who steers through a storm. You'd want a trained navigator, someone who actually understands the sea, the winds, the stars. But in a democracy, Plato argues, that's exactly what happens. The crowd picks the captain, not based on competence, but on charm, on who tells them what they want to hear, on who makes the best promises, regardless of whether those promises make any sense. He warns that democracy elevates rhetoric over wisdom. It rewards people who are persuasive, not people who are right. And over time, that gap between what sounds good and what actually is good becomes a chasm, one that swallows entire civilizations. And here's where it gets really sharp. Plato argues that democracy breeds a specific kind of moral decay. When everyone's opinion is treated as equally valid, people stop deferring to expertise. They stop respecting knowledge. Freedom becomes the highest value, not truth, not justice, not order, just freedom. Freedom to do whatever you want, believe whatever you want, say whatever you want. And that sounds great, until it collapses into chaos. Because Plato points out something that most people don't want to hear. Unlimited freedom doesn't stay free for long. It creates disorder, and disorder creates a demand for someone, anyone, to restore control. That's how democracies produce tyrants. Not through conquest, through exhaustion. The people get so tired of the noise, the division, the dysfunction, that they hand power to whoever promises to fix it, no questions asked. Democracy, in Plato's framework, doesn't die from external attack. It dies from within. It rots. Now, is he right? That's the uncomfortable part, because parts of his analysis are eerily accurate. The rise of demagogues, the weaponization of popular opinion, the slow erosion of trust in institutions. These aren't ancient problems, they're headlines. But here's what makes Plato's idea genuinely dangerous. His solution. He doesn't propose reforming democracy. He proposes replacing it with rule by philosopher kings, an elite class of intellectually superior rulers, trained from birth, who would govern not by consent of the people, but by virtue of their wisdom. In other words, Plato's answer to the dangers of giving power to the unqualified is to hand absolute power to a self-appointed class of the qualified. And who decides who qualifies? The philosophers themselves. That's not just elitist. That's the blueprint for every authoritarian regime that's ever claimed to know better than its people. Every dictatorship that justified itself by saying the masses aren't ready for freedom. They all echo Plato, whether they cite him or not. He diagnosed a real problem, the vulnerability of democratic systems to manipulation, ignorance, and demagoguery. But his cure is worse than the disease. Plato didn't just question democracy. He gave every future tyrant a philosophical excuse to abolish it. Here's an idea that doesn't just challenge how you live, it challenges whether you're living at all, in any meaningful sense. Determinism, the philosophical position that every event, every action, every thought you've ever had was the inevitable result of prior causes. You didn't choose your career. You didn't choose your partner. You didn't even choose to watch this. It was all set in motion long before you were born, by genetics, by environment, by the blind mechanics of cause and effect, stretching back to the beginning of the universe. And some of the sharpest minds in history have argued exactly this. Baruch Spinoza, writing in the 17th century, was blunt about it. He argues that human beings believe they are free only because they are conscious of their desires, but completely ignorant of the causes that determine those desires. Freedom, in Spinoza's view, is a feeling, not a fact. You think you're choosing, you're not. You're just watching yourself do what you were always going to do. Baron Dahlbach took it even further. In The System of Nature, he argues that man is a purely physical being, governed entirely by the laws of nature. There is no soul, no will, no agency. Every decision a person makes is the necessary outcome of their biological makeup and the circumstances acting upon them. Dahlbach doesn't soften this. He says the person who believes in free will is like a fly sitting on a moving carriage, convinced it's steering. And then there's the modern wave. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and philosopher, argues that free will is not just an illusion, it's an incoherent concept. He points to neuroscience experiments, like those conducted by Benjamin Libet, which suggest that the brain initiates decisions before a person is even consciously aware of making them. Your brain decides, then it tells you, and you take credit for it. So why is this dangerous? Because if free will is an illusion, then so is responsibility, and that's where things start to collapse. Think about what holds a society together. Laws, morality, accountability. All of it rests on one assumption, that people can choose, that they could have done otherwise. Remove that assumption, and the entire structure cracks. Why punish a criminal if he couldn't have acted differently? Why praise a hero if her bravery was just neurons firing in a predetermined sequence? Why feel guilt? Why feel pride? Why feel anything at all about your actions if they were never really yours? Philosophers like Dahlbach acknowledged this tension, but argued that punishment could still serve a practical function, as a deterrent, shaping future behavior. But that's a cold, mechanical view of justice. It turns human beings into machines to be programmed, not moral agents to be reasoned with. And here's the darker edge. Throughout history, the denial of free will has been weaponized. If people are just products of their environment, then controlling the environment, controlling them, becomes not just acceptable, but logical. B.F. Skinner's behaviorism ran on this exact premise. Engineer the right conditions, and you engineer the right people. It's social control dressed up as science. The danger of determinism isn't that it might be wrong. The danger is that it might be right, and we have no idea how to build a civilization on that truth. Every system of law, every moral framework, every notion of human dignity assumes that you are, on some level, the author of your own actions. Take that away, and what's left isn't freedom, it's machinery. And machinery doesn't have rights. Martin Heidegger is widely considered one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. His work reshaped how we think about existence, about time, about what it means to be human. Being in time alone is a monumental achievement, dense, original, groundbreaking. And he was a Nazi, not in the casual, swept up by the times way people sometimes try to excuse. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in 1933. He became the rector of the University of Freiburg. He gave speeches praising Adolf Hitler. He implemented Nazi policies in academia. He pushed Jewish colleagues out, including Edmund Husserl, the man who had mentored him, who had made his career possible. Heidegger cut him off, removed the dedication to Husserl from later editions of Being in Time. That's not a man who got caught up in a moment. That's a man who made a choice. But here's what makes Heidegger's case so unsettling and so important to examine. It wasn't that his philosophy existed separately from his politics. The two were entangled. Heidegger didn't just happen to be a brilliant philosopher who also held terrible beliefs. His philosophy gave him a framework, a vocabulary, that made those beliefs feel coherent, even inevitable. Heidegger argued that Western civilization had lost its way, that modernity, with its obsession with technology and rationality, had uprooted human beings from authentic existence. He spoke of a return to origins, a reconnection with something deeper, something rooted in soil and history, and a people's collective destiny. He called it Dasein, being there, the idea that existence is always situated, always embedded in a particular place, a particular heritage. And when the Nazis rose to power, promising national rebirth, promising to restore Germany to its authentic greatness, Heidegger didn't see a political movement. He saw a philosophical one. He believed, or at least convinced himself, that National Socialism was the answer to the crisis of modernity, that Hitler's revolution was a world historical event, a moment where a people could reclaim their essence. He was wrong, catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. But the question that lingers, the one that philosophers and scholars have wrestled with for decades, is whether Heidegger's philosophy itself carries something toxic at its core. Is there something in his rejection of universal reason, in his emphasis on rootedness, on the destiny of a specific people, that naturally bends toward exclusion, toward authoritarianism? Some argue yes, that Heidegger's thought, with its contempt for liberal democracy, its disdain for Enlightenment universalism, and its romanticized vision of collective destiny, was never politically neutral, that it was always vulnerable to exactly the kind of capture that happened. Others argue the philosophy can be separated from the man, that his insights into existence, technology, and alienation remain valuable regardless of his moral failures. But here's what cannot be argued away. Heidegger never truly apologized. After the war, he never offered a clear, unambiguous reckoning with what he'd done. No genuine confrontation with the Holocaust. No accountability. He retreated into silence, or worse, into self-pity. He once compared the industrialization of agriculture to the death camps, as if mechanized farming and mechanized murder belonged in the same sentence. That tells you something, not just about the man, about what a philosophy built on abstraction can do to moral clarity. When your thinking operates at such a high altitude, you can lose sight of the ground entirely, of the bodies on it. Heidegger's genius is undeniable, but so is his complicity, and the lesson he leaves behind isn't subtle. Brilliance does not protect against evil. Sometimes it provides the vocabulary for it. This phrase didn't come from a philosopher. It came from a novel, Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. But the idea behind it? That's pure nihilism, and it's one of the most corrosive ideas ever introduced into human thought. The argument goes like this. If there is no God, we tell ourselves to keep society from collapsing. And if it's fiction, then nothing is really forbidden. Nothing is truly wrong. Everything, in principle, is permitted. Dostoevsky didn't endorse this. He put it in the mouth of a character to expose its horror. But the idea didn't stay in fiction. It leaked out. It spread. And it found its most famous philosophical champion in Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche declared that God is dead. And he didn't say it with celebration. He said it with dread. He understood what it meant. If the foundation of Western morality, the divine authority behind it, crumbles, then the entire structure built on top of it starts to wobble. Moral law, human rights, the sanctity of life, all of it rests on assumptions that, without a metaphysical anchor, become optional.
But here's where it gets dangerous. Nietzsche didn't stop at diagnosis. He offered a prescription. He argued that in the absence of objective values, the strong must create their own. He called this figure the Übermensch, the overman, a being who rises above conventional morality, who imposes meaning on a meaningless world through sheer will. Sounds almost heroic, until you see what happens when people actually try to live it out.
The Nazis borrowed Nietzsche's language, selectively, distortedly, but effectively. They took the Übermensch and turned it into a racial ideal. They took beyond good and evil and used it to justify extermination. Was that Nietzsche's intent? Almost certainly not. His sister, Elizabeth, edited and manipulated his works posthumously to align them with fascist ideology. But the raw material was there, the door was open, and terrible people walked through it. And it wasn't just the Nazis. The broader logic of nihilism, the idea that moral truth is an illusion, has been used to justify everything from political terror to personal cruelty. If nothing matters, then why not lie? Why not cheat? Why not kill? The removal of moral foundations doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to a vacuum. And vacuums get filled, usually by whoever has the most power and the fewest scruples.
Now, defenders of Nietzsche will argue fairly that he was warning against passive nihilism, not promoting it. He wanted humanity to confront the abyss, not fall into it. He wanted people to create meaning actively, courageously. And that's true. But the problem with handing someone a loaded weapon and saying use it wisely is that most people don't. Albert Camus understood this tension better than almost anyone. He argued in The Myth of Sisyphus that the real question nihilism raises isn't, is everything permitted? It's, is life worth living at all? And his answer was yes.
But not because of some grand cosmic purpose, simply because we choose it. We rebel against the absurdity. We push the boulder up the hill, knowing it will roll back down. But Camus also recognized something critical. The moment you declare nothing is true, you don't get liberation. You get chaos. You get strongmen. You get ideologies that fill the void with blood.
The phrase, nothing is true, everything is permitted, isn't a philosophy. It's a threat. And history has proven repeatedly just how real that threat is. Friedrich Nietzsche is probably the most misunderstood philosopher in history, and that misunderstanding got people killed. Here's what happened. Nietzsche introduced the concept of the Übermensch, the overman or superman, in his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and on the surface it sounds explosive. A being beyond conventional morality, beyond good and evil. Someone who creates their own values, refuses to submit to the herd, and lives with absolute self-mastery. Sounds like a blueprint for tyranny, right? That's exactly how it was read. But that reading is a catastrophic distortion. What Nietzsche actually argued was deeply personal, not political. He looked at a world where God,
the foundation of Western morality for centuries, was, in his words, dead. Not literally, culturally. The Enlightenment, science, modernity, they had eroded the authority of religion. And Nietzsche saw what was coming next, a vacuum, a crisis of meaning, what he called nihilism, the terrifying possibility that nothing matters, that there is no objective purpose, no cosmic order telling you how to live. The Übermensch was Nietzsche's answer to that void. Not a racial superior, not a conqueror, an individual who could stare into meaninglessness and, instead of collapsing, create meaning from within. Someone who could impose value on existence through sheer will and creativity. He was talking about spiritual strength, intellectual courage, self-overcoming. So how did this become a Nazi talking point? Enter Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, his sister, and one of the most destructive editors in intellectual history. After Nietzsche's mental collapse in 1889, Elisabeth took control of his unpublished writings. She was a committed anti-Semite, married to a prominent nationalist, and she did something unforgivable. She curated, rearranged, and selectively published his notes to make them fit a nationalist, racially supremacist agenda. The result was The Will to Power, a book Nietzsche never wrote, not as it was published anyway. Elisabeth assembled it, shaped it, weaponized it. And the Nazis ate it up. Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive. He posed for photos with a bust of the philosopher. The regime absorbed the language, the Übermensch, the will to power, the rejection of conventional morality, and twisted it into a justification for Aryan supremacy, for domination, for genocide. But here's what they conveniently left out. Nietzsche despised nationalism. He called it a sickness. He broke with Richard Wagner partly over Wagner's anti-Semitism. He wrote explicitly against the kind of herd mentality that fascism depends on. In Beyond Good and Evil, he mocked the Germans and their obsession with racial purity. He wanted individuals to rise above mass movements, not lead them. The irony is staggering. The philosopher who warned against blind obedience to ideology had his ideas hijacked to fuel one of the worst ideologies in human history. Not because his ideas naturally led there, but because they were deliberately mutilated by someone with an agenda, and because people didn't bother to read the source material. And that's the real danger here. It's not just about Nietzsche. It's about what happens when powerful ideas land in careless or malicious hands. You strip the context, you cherry-pick the language, you flatten the nuance, and suddenly a call for individual self-creation becomes a mandate for racial extermination. Nietzsche himself saw this coming. He once wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster." His own legacy became proof of that warning. The man who fought against dogma had his words turned into dogma. The man who rejected the herd had his philosophy consumed by one. That's not just irony. That's a lesson, and it's one that still hasn't been learned. Here's a question that should keep you up at night. What if the worst atrocities in human history weren't committed by monsters? What if they were committed by bureaucrats? That's the core of Hannah Arendt's most dangerous idea, the banality of evil. In 1961, Arendt traveled to Jerusalem to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, the man who organized the logistics of genocide, the trains, the schedules, the systematic transportation of millions of human beings to their deaths. And when Arendt sat in that courtroom, she expected to see a devil, a psychopath, some kind of extraordinary monster whose evil was written into his very nature. She didn't. What she saw instead was a small, dull, unremarkable man, a man who spoke in clichés, who hid behind procedure,
who insisted over and over again that he was just following orders, just doing his job. Eichmann wasn't driven by hatred. He wasn't driven by ideology. Not really. He was driven by careerism, by obedience, by the desire to be seen as efficient. And that, Arendt argues, is far more terrifying than any demon. She coins the phrase the banality of evil to describe this phenomenon. Evil, she contends, doesn't always arrive with fangs and fury. Sometimes it arrives in a gray suit, carrying a clipboard, asking no questions. The kind of evil that doesn't require malice, just compliance, just a willingness to stop thinking. That's the knife's edge of Arendt's argument. She doesn't say Eichmann was innocent. She doesn't excuse him. She says something worse. She says he was thoughtless. Not stupid, thoughtless. He had surrendered his capacity to think critically, to judge independently, to look at what he was doing and ask the most basic human question: is this right? And Arendt warns that this is not a one-time failure. This is a permanent vulnerability in human nature. The machinery of evil doesn't need fanatics at every level. It needs them at the top. Everyone else? It just needs them to show up, to clock in, to follow the process, to not ask questions. And most people, most ordinary, decent, law-abiding people, will do exactly that, because obedience is comfortable, because thinking is hard, because standing alone against a system is something almost nobody is willing to do. That's what makes this idea so dangerous. It strips away the comforting illusion that evil is something other people do. Bad people, broken people, people fundamentally different from us. Arendt demolishes that illusion. She argues that the capacity for evil lives inside the most ordinary human being, not as some dormant darkness waiting to be unleashed, but as a simple failure, a failure to think. And the implications are staggering, because if Arendt is right, then no society is safe. No system of laws, no institution, no democracy is immune. All it takes is the right conditions. The right authority structure, the right amount of pressure, and ordinary people will participate in extraordinary horror, not because they want to, but because they never stopped to consider what they were doing. Arendt isn't offering comfort here. She's offering a mirror, and what's reflected back is deeply uncomfortable. The Holocaust wasn't carried out by a nation of psychopaths. It was carried out by clerks and conductors and middle managers. People who loved their children, people who paid their taxes, people who in any other context would have been called good citizens. That's the banality of evil, and it's one of the most unsettling ideas ever put to paper. Plato is one of the most celebrated thinkers in Western civilization. His name carries weight in every university, every philosophy department, every intellectual tradition worth its salt. And yet, buried inside his most famous work is one of the most chilling ideas ever put to paper. In the Republic, Plato doesn't just theorize about justice or the ideal state. He lays out a blueprint for a society where the rulers, his so-called philosopher kings, decide who gets to breed and who doesn't. He argues that the state should control reproduction the same way a farmer breeds livestock, the strong with the strong, the best with the best, and the rest quietly discarded. That's not a metaphor. Plato explicitly proposes that children born from inferior unions or children born with defects should be hidden away, disposed of. He uses softer language, sure. He talks about sending them to the appropriate place. But let's not dress it up. He is talking about the systematic abandonment of infants. And here's what makes it dangerous. Plato doesn't frame this as cruelty.
he frames it as necessity, as the rational cost of building a perfect society. In his view, the health of the collective outweighs the life of the individual. If a life doesn't serve the state, that life doesn't deserve to exist. That's the logic. Cold, clean, terrifying.
This wasn't some fringe idea that disappeared with the ancient world. It echoed, loudly, through centuries of Western thought. The eugenics movement of the early 20th century didn't emerge from nowhere. It had intellectual ancestry, and Plato sits near the root of that family tree. When governments in Europe and America began forcibly sterilizing people they deemed unfit, the disabled, the poor, the mentally ill, they weren't acting on impulse. They were acting on a principle that says some human beings are worth more than others, a principle Plato helped legitimize over 2,000 years ago. And then came the darkest chapter. The Nazi regime took this idea and pushed it to its absolute extreme. Lebens unwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. That was the phrase. And it wasn't just rhetoric, it was policy. Hundreds of thousands of disabled people were murdered under the T4 program before the Holocaust even began in full. The philosophical scaffolding for that horror, it starts with the idea that a human life can be weighed, measured, and found wanting, an idea Plato articulated with calm, reasoned authority.
Now, does that mean Plato intended genocide? No, of course not. He was writing in a different time, under different assumptions. But that's exactly the point. Dangerous ideas don't need malicious intent to cause devastation. They just need to sound reasonable enough for someone, somewhere, to act on them. And that's the real warning here. Plato presents this idea inside a framework of reason, of order, of the greater good. He doesn't sound like a tyrant, he sounds like a planner. And that's what makes it so seductive and so lethal. Because when you wrap inhumanity in the language of logic, people don't recoil, they nod along.
The idea that some lives aren't worth living didn't die with ancient Athens. It kept resurfacing in policy, in law, in institutional practice, every time a society decided that efficiency mattered more than dignity. Every time someone in power looked at another human being and asked, but what are they contributing? Plato may not have intended the horrors that followed, but he opened a door, and history walked right through it. They're ideas that challenge power, ideas that reshape nations. And then there are ideas that don't just challenge truth, they try to dissolve it entirely. Postmodernism is that idea. It didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in through university departments, literary theory, and cultural criticism. But make no mistake, what postmodernism proposed was one of the most radical philosophical moves in modern history. Not a new truth, the abolition of truth itself.
Jean-François Lyotard defined the postmodern condition as essentially an incredulity toward meta-narratives, grand stories, progress, reason, science, religion, universal human rights. He argued these weren't discoveries, they were constructions, stories the powerful told to keep the world organized in their favor. And Lyotard said we should stop believing them. That sounds liberating for about 5 minutes. Because here's what happens when you pull that thread. If no grand narrative is trustworthy, then no shared framework for reality holds. Nothing is foundational. Everything becomes interpretation. Jacques Derrida pushed this further with deconstruction. He argued that language itself is unstable, that texts don't have fixed meanings, that every statement contains contradictions it tries to suppress. There is nothing outside the text, Derrida famously claimed. Meaning doesn't point to reality, it just points to more meaning, an endless loop with no exit. And Michel Foucault, arguably the most influential of the postmodernists,
took it somewhere even darker. Foucault argued that truth is not something we find, it's something that gets produced by institutions, by systems of power. What counts as true in any society, he claimed, is simply what the dominant power structures have authorized as true. Knowledge and power, in Foucault's framework, are inseparable. You don't speak truth to power, power speaks truth to you. Now, there's something genuinely useful buried in all of this. Questioning dominant narratives matters. Recognizing that power shapes what gets accepted as knowledge, that's not paranoia, that's history. Foucault wasn't wrong to point out that medical institutions, prisons, and governments have all used truth as a weapon of control. He wasn't wrong about that. But here's where it turns dangerous. When you tell an entire generation of thinkers that truth is just a power game, you don't get liberated critical thinkers, you get paralysis, or worse, you get people who believe that asserting something loudly enough makes it real. If truth is just a construct, then my construct is as valid as yours. My feelings are as valid as your facts. My ideology is as valid as your evidence. That's not freedom. That's intellectual collapse. Richard Rorty, one of the more accessible postmodern aligned thinkers, openly argued that truth is simply what your peers will let you get away with saying. Not what's accurate, not what's verifiable, just what your social group agrees on. And he said this like it was a feature, not a bug. The real-world fallout? It's everywhere. Post-truth politics, the erosion of expertise, conspiracy thinking dressed up as just asking questions. The inability to have a shared conversation about basic facts because the very concept of a fact has been philosophically undermined. Postmodernism didn't cause all of this on its own. That would be too simple. But it handed the tools to anyone who wanted to tear down the idea that reality is something we can agree on. And that's the cruel irony. Postmodernism began as a critique of power. It ended up becoming the perfect weapon for the powerful. Because when nothing is true, the loudest voice wins. And the loudest voice is almost never the most honest one. There's a phrase that's been used to justify more suffering than almost any other in human history: the greater good. It sounds noble, it sounds reasonable, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. The idea has roots that run deep. Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, laid it out plainly in the late 18th century. He argued that the right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Simple math. Add up the pleasure, subtract the pain, and whatever comes out on top, that's the moral choice. Bentham wasn't being sinister. He genuinely believed this was the most rational, most humane framework for ethics, a way to cut through the fog of tradition, religion, and superstition, and ground morality in something measurable. But here's the problem Bentham never solved, and it's a fatal one. The moment you reduce morality to a calculation, the moment you start weighing one group's happiness against another group's suffering, you open a door that can never be fully closed. Because if the math checks out, anything can be justified. Anything. John Stuart Mill tried to refine Bentham's framework. He argued that not all pleasures are equal, that intellectual and moral pleasures are superior to mere physical ones. Mill wanted to add nuance, to prevent utilitarianism from becoming a crude numbers game. But even Mill couldn't escape the core logic. His version still permits, even demands, the sacrifice of the few for the benefit of the many. As long as the outcome maximizes overall well-being, the individual becomes expendable. And that's not a hypothetical concern. That's history. Every regime that has committed atrocities on a mass scale has invoked some version of the greater good. Stalin's collectivization, Mao's Great Leap Forward, the forced sterilization programs across Europe and America in the early 20th century. none of these were carried out by people who thought they were doing evil. They believed, fully, sincerely, that they were serving a larger purpose, that the suffering they caused was a necessary cost, a price worth paying. This is what makes utilitarian thinking in its most unchecked form one of the most dangerous ideas in the history of philosophy. Not because it's wrong about everything, but because it gives moral cover to monstrous acts. It wraps cruelty in the language of reason. It makes the unthinkable sound logical. Peter Singer, one of the most influential utilitarian philosophers alive today, has pushed this logic to places that make even his admirers uncomfortable. He has argued that under specific extreme conditions of suffering, the termination of a newborn's life could be philosophically justified. He's argued that failing to donate most of your income to charity is morally equivalent to letting someone drown. Singer doesn't flinch from the implications of his framework, and to his credit, he's honest about where the math leads. But that honesty should alarm you, because the math leads to places no sane society should want to go. The real danger here isn't utilitarianism itself. It's the seduction of certainty that comes with it. The idea that morality can be solved like an equation, that there's always a right answer, and it's always the one that produces the best outcome, no matter who gets crushed in the process. Once you accept that individuals can be sacrificed for the collective, you haven't built a moral framework. You've built a machine, and machines don't care who they grind up. That's not ethics. That's arithmetic with a conscience turned off. Most philosophers asked, what is good? Niccolo Machiavelli asked something far more unsettling. What works? And that single shift in questioning changed the course of political history forever. Machiavelli wasn't some armchair thinker. He was a diplomat in Renaissance Florence. He watched governments rise and collapse. He saw leaders get betrayed, exiled, murdered. He saw what happened to rulers who played nice. They lost, every single time. So when he sat down to write The Prince in 1513, he wasn't writing philosophy. He was writing a survival manual, a cold, calculated blueprint for how to seize power and keep it. Here's where it gets dangerous. Machiavelli argues that morality and politics are two completely separate things, that a ruler who tries to be good in every situation will inevitably be destroyed by those who aren't. He doesn't say cruelty is admirable, he says it's necessary. A prince, he writes, must learn how not to be good and use that knowledge as the situation demands, not out of malice, out of strategy. That's a line most thinkers before him refuse to cross. He goes further. Machiavelli claims it's better to be feared than loved, because love is fickle. People will turn on a generous leader the moment it suits them, but fear is reliable. Fear holds. He's not endorsing tyranny for the sake of it. He's making a pragmatic argument about human nature, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like realism. And rulers throughout history have used that realism to justify horrific things. Deception? Machiavelli treats it like a tool, a necessary one. He argues that a prince should appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, but be ready to act against all of those qualities when the moment calls for it. The image of virtue matters more than virtue itself. What people believe about you is more powerful than what you actually are. Think about how corrosive that idea is. He's essentially saying that politics is theater, that the most effective leaders are the best performers, and the audience, the people, are just something to be managed. Now, did Machiavelli invent political deception? Of course not. Leaders had been lying and scheming for centuries before he was born, but he did something no one else had done. He wrote it down. He stripped away the pretense. He said the quiet part loud. And once an idea like that is codified, it doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. The Prince became a handbook, not just for Renaissance rulers, but for dictators, strongmen, and political operatives across centuries. Napoleon studied it. Mussolini praised it. Stalin reportedly kept a copy annotated in his own hand. Every authoritarian regime in modern history owes at least a philosophical debt to Machiavelli's core argument that power is its own justification. And here's the part people miss. Machiavelli wasn't necessarily endorsing any of this. Some scholars argue the Prince was satirical, a warning, not a recommendation. Others say he wrote it to curry favor with the Medici family after being exiled and tortured. His motivations are still debated, but motivations don't matter once the words are loose in the world. What Machiavelli unleashed was the idea that ethics are optional in governance, that the only real sin in politics is losing. And once you accept that framework, once you separate power from principle, there's no floor, no limit, no line that can't be crossed. That's the danger. Not what Machiavelli said, but what he gave permission for. Here's something most people get wrong. Survival of the fittest, that phrase everyone attributes to Charles Darwin, he didn't coin it, Herbert Spencer did. And Spencer wasn't talking about finches on the Galapagos. He was talking about people, about societies, about who deserves to thrive and who deserves to be left behind. Darwin used the phrase later, almost casually, as a shorthand for natural selection. But Spencer saw something else entirely. He looked at the natural world, the predation, the competition, the extinction of weaker species, and he said, yes, that's how human civilization should work too. The strong rise, the weak fall. And any attempt to interfere with that process, charity, welfare, social safety nets, is not just wasteful, it's dangerous. It weakens the species. That idea became known as social Darwinism, and it didn't stay in philosophy journals. It walked straight into politics, economics, and eventually into some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Spencer argued that poverty was nature's way of pruning the unfit, that suffering wasn't a problem to solve, it was a mechanism to respect. He opposed public education. He opposed aid for the poor. Not because he was cruel for cruelty's sake, but because he genuinely believed that helping the weak would drag the entire species down. Let them struggle, let them fail. That's how progress works. And people listened. Industrialists loved it. Colonizers loved it. If you're powerful and someone hands you a philosophy that says your power is proof of your biological superiority, you don't question that. You frame it, you fund it. But here's where it gets truly dangerous. Social Darwinism didn't just justify wealth inequality. It laid the intellectual groundwork for eugenics. Francis Galton, Darwin's own cousin, took Spencer's logic and pushed it further. He argued that humanity could be improved through selective breeding, encourage the fit to reproduce, discourage or prevent the unfit from doing the same. And this wasn't fringe thinking. Eugenics programs were implemented in the United States, in Scandinavia, across Europe. Tens of thousands of people were forcibly sterilized. Not in secret, legally, with public support, because the philosophy told them it was rational, it was scientific, it was for the greater good. Then the Nazis took it to its logical extreme. The Holocaust didn't emerge from nowhere. It had intellectual roots, and one of those roots was this very idea, that some lives are biologically more valuable than others, and that nature demands the elimination of the weak. Now, Does that mean Darwin is to blame? No. Darwin described a biological process. He observed nature. But Spencer, Galton, and those who followed them did something far more reckless. They took a descriptive theory, this is how nature works, and turned it into a prescriptive one, this is how society should work. That leap from is to ought is one of the most dangerous moves in the history of ideas. And it's still happening. Every time someone argues that billionaires deserve their wealth because they're simply better than everyone else. Every time someone frames poverty as a personal failing rather than a systemic one, every time someone suggests that certain populations are genetically predisposed to crime or ignorance, the ghost of social Darwinism is right there, dressed up in new language, but the logic is identical. Spencer's philosophy gave the powerful a clean conscience. It told them that dominance wasn't something to feel guilty about. It was evolution in action. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Not because it's obviously monstrous, but because it sounds reasonable. It sounds scientific. It sounds like nature itself is on your side. It isn't. There is one idea that has toppled more thrones, sparked more bloodshed, and rewritten more maps than any army ever could. And it didn't come from a general. It came from a philosopher. Jean-Jacques Rousseau opened his 1762 work, The Social Contract, with a line that would burn through history like wildfire. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. That's it. That's the spark. Rousseau argued that human beings are naturally good, that they're born equal, and that it's society, its institutions, its hierarchies, its so-called civilization that corrupts them. He didn't just question authority, he declared it illegitimate. Unless, and this is the key part, unless that authority comes directly from the will of the people. Now, that might sound reasonable, even noble, but here's where it gets dangerous. Rousseau introduced a concept he called the general will, the idea that there exists a collective will of the people and that this will is always right, always. Not the will of the majority necessarily, not a vote, not a compromise. The general will is what the people would want if they were fully informed, fully rational, and fully virtuous. And anyone who disagrees with it, Rousseau said they should be forced to be free. Forced to be free. That phrase alone should send a chill down your spine, because what Rousseau essentially handed to history was a philosophical justification for tyranny dressed in the language of liberation. If a leader claims to know the general will, claims to speak for the people, then anyone who dissents isn't just wrong, they're an enemy of freedom itself. And that's exactly what happened. The French Revolution took Rousseau's ideas and ran with them. Robespierre practically worshipped the man. He carried the social contract like scripture. And under the banner of liberty, equality, and the general will, the revolution devolved into the reign of terror. Thousands executed, not by a king, by the people, or rather by those who claimed to act in their name. But it didn't stop there. Rousseau's fingerprints are on almost every revolution that followed. The Haitian Revolution, the revolutions of 1848 across Europe, the Russian Revolution, Mao's Cultural Revolution. Every single one of them echoed the same Rousseauian logic. The people are good, the system is corrupt. Tear it all down and rebuild. And every single one of them faced the same problem Rousseau never solved. Who decides what the general will actually is? Who gets to define the people? Because the moment you answer that question, you've created a new authority, a new hierarchy, a new set of chains. John Locke had argued something similar before Rousseau, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that people have a right to overthrow tyranny. But Locke built in limits. He talked about natural rights, property, due process, checks on power. Rousseau didn't bother with any of that. He went straight for the absolute, the total surrender of the individual to the collective.
And that's what makes his ideas so dangerous. Not because revolution is always wrong, sometimes it's necessary, but because Rousseau gave revolutionaries a blank check, a philosophical framework that says, if you're acting in the name of the people, you can do anything. History has shown again and again what happens when someone cashes that check. The idea that man is born free didn't just start revolutions, it justified the worst things done in their name. There's a philosophy that reduces every human life to arithmetic, cold, clean arithmetic, and it's been used to justify some of the most horrifying decisions in modern history. It's called utilitarianism, and at its core, it sounds almost reasonable. Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century philosopher who formalized the idea, argued that the right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Simple, elegant. Moral questions? Just do the math. Add up the pleasure, subtract the pain, and whatever option leaves you with the highest total, that's the ethical choice. Bentham called it the philosophic calculus, a literal formula for morality. And on the surface, it's hard to argue with. Who wouldn't want to maximize happiness? Who wouldn't want to minimize suffering? But here's where it gets dangerous. If the math says sacrificing one person saves 5, then you sacrifice the one. No hesitation, no guilt. The number said so. And if the math says sacrificing 1,000 saves 1,000,000, same logic, same cold equation. You do it. You have to. Because according to Bentham's framework, refusing to sacrifice that one person, or that 1,000, is the immoral choice. You see the problem. This isn't just a thought experiment. This is the logic behind real-world atrocities. Every government that has ever justified collateral damage, forced relocations, or the elimination of a minority group for the greater good, they were running Bentham's equation. Maybe not consciously, but the structure is identical. The many outweigh the few. The ends justify the means. The math checks out. John Stuart Mill, Bentham's intellectual successor, tried to soften this. He argued that not all pleasures are equal, that higher pleasures, like intellectual and moral fulfillment, carry more weight than base satisfaction. It was an attempt to add nuance. But Mill never solved the fundamental problem. He still accepted the premise that morality is a numbers game. He just wanted to tweak the formula. And then there's Peter Singer, the most prominent utilitarian alive today. Singer takes the logic further than most people are comfortable with. He argues that if you can prevent suffering without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, you are obligated to do so. Sounds noble, but Singer's framework has led him to conclusions that make even his supporters uneasy, including arguments about the moral status of disabled infants that have sparked outrage across the globe. That's the trap of utilitarianism. It doesn't start extreme. It starts with a principle almost everyone agrees with: reduce suffering, increase well-being. But once you accept that morality is just a calculation, there's no firewall. There's no point where the equation stops and human dignity begins. Because dignity isn't quantifiable. Rights aren't quantifiable. And the moment you try to quantify them, you've already lost them. Philippa Foot understood this. Her famous trolley problem, do you pull the lever to divert the trolley, killing one person to save 5, wasn't designed to give people an easy answer. It was designed to expose the fault lines in utilitarian thinking, to show that there's something deeply unsettling about a moral system that treats people as variables in an equation. And yet, utilitarianism remains one of the most influential ethical frameworks in the world.
Governments use it, corporations use it, policymakers use it every single day. That should concern you, not because maximizing well-being is a bad goal, but because any system that tells you it's moral to sacrifice the few for the many, without exception, without limit, isn't a moral system at all. It's a permission slip. Jean-Paul Sartre made a claim that sounds liberating on the surface, but sit with it long enough and it starts to crush you. He argued that human beings are condemned to be free, not blessed with freedom, not gifted it, condemned to it. That word choice matters. Sartre wasn't celebrating, he was diagnosing. In his view, there is no God, no predetermined human nature, no cosmic script telling you who you are or what you're supposed to do. You exist first, and then you define yourself, entirely through your choices, every single one of them. That's his concept of radical freedom, and it carries a brutal corollary. If you are completely free, then you are completely responsible for everything: your career, your relationships, your suffering, your failures. There's no one else to blame, no circumstance to hide behind, no excuse that holds up. Sartre calls any attempt to dodge that responsibility bad faith, blaming your upbringing, blaming society, saying, "I had no choice." All of it, bad faith. He argues that even in the most constrained situations, a person still chooses how to respond. A prisoner chooses how to endure. A soldier chooses whether to pull the trigger. There's always a choice, always. And that's where the danger begins. Because taken to its logical extreme, Sartre's framework erases the very idea of a victim. Think about that. If everyone is always free, always choosing, then no one is ever truly trapped. No one is ever truly oppressed in a way that removes their agency. The abused spouse, they're choosing to stay. The exploited worker, they're choosing to comply. That's the dark edge of radical freedom. It can slide very easily into a philosophy of total blame. Sartre himself was politically engaged. He supported leftist causes, anti-colonial movements, worker struggles. He clearly recognized systemic injustice on a political level. But his philosophy, his actual philosophical framework, it leaves very little room for structural oppression. It puts the weight of the entire world on the individual's shoulders, and that weight can be paralyzing. Here's the other side of it. If there's no human nature, no essence, then there's no foundation for morality either. Sartre acknowledges this openly. He argues that values aren't discovered, they're invented by each person in each moment. You don't find meaning, you make it, and no one else's meaning has any authority over yours. Now, that sounds bold, independent, but follow it through. If every individual is the sole author of their own values, then on what grounds do you condemn anyone? The tyrant who chooses domination is, in Sartre's framework, just as authentic as the humanitarian who chooses compassion, as long as both are acting in full awareness of their freedom. Sartre tries to argue his way out of this corner, suggesting that choosing freedom for yourself means choosing it for all. But critics have pointed out, rightly, that this feels more like a patch than a foundation. It doesn't hold the weight he needs it to. And this is the tension Sartre never fully resolved. He hands you absolute freedom and absolute responsibility, but strips away the moral scaffolding that might help you carry it. No guidelines, no guardrails, just you, alone, in a universe that offers no answers. It's not that Sartre was wrong about everything. Personal responsibility matters, agency matters. But when you push the idea to its extreme, when you refuse to acknowledge that circumstance, systems, and power shape human lives in ways people can't always overcome, you don't get liberation. You get abandonment dressed up as philosophy. There's a line of thinking that has justified more atrocities than any army ever could. It doesn't sound evil. It sounds reasonable, practical even. The ends justify the means. 5 words, and behind them, a body count that stretches across centuries. Niccolo Machiavelli is usually the first name that comes up. And fair enough. In The Prince, Machiavelli argued that a ruler must be willing to act against morality, against mercy, against honesty, against faith, if the stability of the state demands it. He didn't flinch. He wrote that a prince must learn how not to be good, and use that knowledge as circumstances require. Cruelty, deception, betrayal, all acceptable, as long as they serve the outcome.
Now, defenders of Machiavelli will say he was being descriptive, not prescriptive, just telling it like it is. Maybe, but what he actually did was give every ambitious ruler a philosophical permission slip. You're not being immoral, you're being strategic, and that permission slip never expired.
The utilitarian tradition took this logic and gave it a formal structure. Jeremy Bentham argued that the morality of an action is determined entirely by its consequences, specifically by how much pleasure or pain it produces. The greatest good for the greatest number. That's the standard. Not intentions, not rights, not dignity, just outcomes. On paper, that sounds civilized. In practice, it opens a trapdoor. Because if only outcomes matter, then anything done in service of a greater good becomes defensible. Inflict agonizing pain on one person to save 100? The math checks out. Sacrifice a minority to benefit the majority? Bentham's calculus has no built-in objection. The individual becomes expendable the moment the numbers tilt against them. John Stuart Mill tried to refine this. He argued that not all pleasures are equal, that intellectual and moral pleasures are higher than mere physical satisfaction. He tried to build guardrails, but the engine underneath was still the same. Consequences determine morality, and once you accept that engine, the guardrails are optional. Every regime that wanted to could and did strip them off, and they did, over and over. The 20th century is a graveyard of ends justify the means thinking. Lenin explicitly embraced this logic. Revolutionary violence, mass repression, the liquidation of entire classes of people, all justified because the end goal was a communist utopia. The suffering was temporary, he argued. The paradise was permanent. Millions died waiting for that paradise. It never arrived. The same logic ran through Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, and every totalitarian project that told its citizens, your pain serves a higher purpose. Trust the plan. Don't ask questions. But here's what makes this idea so dangerous. It's not just a dictator's tool. It lives in boardrooms, in policy debates, in everyday moral reasoning. Every time someone says, I know it's wrong, but it's for the best, that's the same logic, just scaled down. The structure is identical, only the stakes change. Immanuel Kant saw this clearly. He argued that some actions are simply wrong, regardless of the outcome. A lie is a lie, even if it produces a good result. A person must never be used merely as a means to an end. Kant drew a hard line, and people have been trying to erase it ever since. Because the truth is, the ends justify the means isn't really a philosophy, it's an escape hatch, a way to do terrible things and still sleep at night. And the moment you accept it, the moment you say the outcome is all that matters, you've lost something you can't calculate your way back to.
In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote 3 words that shook the foundations of Western civilization: God is dead. And most people who quote him have absolutely no idea what he actually meant. Nietzsche wasn't celebrating. He wasn't some gleeful atheist popping champagne over the decline of religion. He was terrified. He saw what was coming,
and he was sounding the alarm. See, for centuries, the entire moral architecture of the West was built on a single foundation: God. Right and wrong, purpose and meaning, justice and redemption, all of it rested on the assumption that there was a divine order, a higher authority, a reason behind everything. And Nietzsche argued that the Enlightenment, science, and modern rationalism had quietly dismantled that foundation, not with a dramatic explosion, but brick by brick, slowly, irreversibly. And his question wasn't whether God existed or not. His question was far more urgent. What happens to a civilization that loses the thing its entire value system was built on? The answer, Nietzsche warned, was nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, that life has no inherent meaning, no objective purpose, no moral compass. He called it the uncanniest of all guests, something that would creep into every corner of modern life, not as a loud, dramatic crisis, but as a quiet rot, a slow emptying out. And he was right. Look around. The signs are everywhere. Rising rates of depression, anxiety, addiction, suicide, especially among young people. A generation drowning in comfort but starving for meaning. Nietzsche predicted this over a century ago. He argued that once the old values collapsed and nothing replaced them, people wouldn't become free. They'd become lost. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. Nietzsche didn't just diagnose the problem. He also saw what people would do in response. They'd look for substitutes, cheap replacements for the God-shaped hole in their lives. Political ideologies, nationalism, consumerism, anything that could fill the void, even temporarily. And those substitutes, Nietzsche warned, could become far more destructive than the religion they replaced. The 20th century proved him prophetic. Marxism, fascism, totalitarianism, all of them, in different ways, tried to fill the vacuum left by the collapse of traditional meaning. They offered people a new story, a new purpose, a new God, and millions died for it. Now, Nietzsche's own answer to nihilism was the concept of the Übermensch, the overman, a being who creates their own values, their own meaning, without relying on any external authority. He argued that the truly strong individual doesn't need God or tradition to tell them what matters. They decide for themselves. It was radical, it was bold, and it was immediately misused. The Nazis twisted Nietzsche's Übermensch into a justification for racial supremacy. His sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, edited and distorted his work after his mental collapse to align it with her own anti-Semitic agenda. Nietzsche himself would have despised this. He openly condemned nationalism and anti-Semitism in his writings. But it didn't matter. The idea was loose in the world, and dangerous people found dangerous uses for it. That's the thing about philosophical ideas. Once they leave the page, the philosopher loses control. Nietzsche gave the world a diagnosis that was devastatingly accurate. But the cure he proposed, radical individual self-creation, requires a strength and integrity that most people simply don't have. And in the hands of the wrong people, the idea that nothing is true, everything is permitted, doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to chaos, to tyranny, to horror. Nietzsche saw the abyss. He just underestimated how many people would willingly jump in. Plato looked at democracy and saw a disaster, not a flawed system, not a work in progress, a disaster. He watched Athens, the birthplace of democratic governance, execute his mentor Socrates. The crowd voted for it. The majority decided that the wisest man in the city needed to die, and Plato never forgave them for it. So he built something else. In the Republic, written around 375 BC, Plato lays out his vision for the ideal state, and at the center of it sits one of the most seductive and most dangerous ideas in all of philosophy,
that only philosophers should rule. He calls them philosopher kings, rulers who have spent decades in rigorous intellectual training, who have ascended through his famous allegory of the case, moving from shadows and illusions to the blinding light of truth. These are the only people, Plato argues, who can see reality as it actually is. Everyone else, still staring at shadows on the wall, mistaking flickering images for the real thing. And here's where the danger starts. Plato doesn't just argue that some people are better suited to lead. He argues that most people are fundamentally incapable of governing themselves. He divides society into 3 rigid classes: gold souls, the philosophers, born to rule; silver souls, the warriors, born to protect; and bronze souls, the workers, the farmers, the merchants, born to obey. This isn't a meritocracy. It's a hierarchy baked into human nature, at least according to Plato. You don't earn your place, you're assigned it. And to make sure no one questions this arrangement, Plato proposes what he openly calls the noble lie, a myth told to every citizen from birth, that the gods made some people with gold in their souls, some with silver, some with bronze. It's a fabrication. Plato knows it's a fabrication, but he argues it's a necessary one, because the stability of the state depends on people accepting their place without resistance. Read that again. The father of Western philosophy is advocating for state-sponsored propaganda, deliberate deception of the population, for their own good. That phrase, for their own good, has been the justification for every authoritarian overreach in history. Plato's system strips away individual freedom and replaces it with order. The philosopher kings control education. They control reproduction. Yes, Plato argues for selective breeding to produce superior citizens. They control what stories are told, what music is played, what art is allowed. Because in Plato's view, an unregulated mind is a dangerous mind, and a dangerous mind threatens the state. Now, Plato wasn't writing a political manifesto. He was constructing an ideal, a thought experiment about justice in the soul. Many scholars argue that the Republic was never meant as a literal blueprint. It was philosophy, abstraction. But abstractions have consequences. The idea that an enlightened few should rule over the ignorant many didn't die with Plato. It echoed through centuries, through monarchies that claimed divine right, through colonial regimes that called themselves civilizing missions, through totalitarian states that insisted the party knew best. Every system that has ever said the people can't be trusted is standing on ground that Plato cleared. And that's the trap. Plato's argument feels rational. It sounds like common sense. Wouldn't you want the smartest, most educated person making decisions? But the moment you accept that premise, you've also accepted that some people's voices don't matter, that freedom is a privilege granted by the wise, not a right held by all. Plato didn't intend to build a cage, but he drew the blueprints for one.
There's a philosophical idea so unsettling that most thinkers don't even want to engage with it seriously. Not because it's stupid, but because it's nearly impossible to refute. And that's what makes it terrifying. Solipsism. The idea that the only thing you can be certain exists, truly, absolutely certain, is your own mind. Everything else, the people around you, the world you see, the conversations you have, could be an illusion, could be a projection, could be nothing more than your consciousness generating an elaborate simulation for an audience of one. René Descartes opened this door. He didn't call himself a solipsist. He'd have rejected the label. But his method of radical doubt made solipsism almost inevitable. Descartes stripped away every assumption. The senses can deceive. The physical world might not be real. Other people could be figments. The only thing he couldn't doubt was the act of doubting itself. I think, therefore I am. That's it. That's all he could guarantee. his own thinking, his own existence, nobody else's. And once that door is open, it's very hard to close. George Berkeley pushed things further. He argued that material objects don't exist independently of perception. A tree in the forest doesn't exist unless it's being perceived. Berkeley saved himself from full solipsism by invoking God. God is always perceiving, so the world remains real. But strip away that theological safety net, and you're left standing alone in a universe that might be entirely inside your own head. Now, most philosophers treat solipsism as a reductio ad absurdum, a logical dead end that proves something went wrong in the reasoning. And fair enough, no serious philosopher walks around genuinely believing they're the only conscious being in existence. But here's the problem. Nobody has ever produced a definitive, airtight refutation of it. Not one. You can't prove other minds exist. You assume they do, you infer they do, you behave as though they do. But proof? That's a different thing entirely. You experience your own consciousness directly. Everyone else's, you're just guessing. And that's where the danger lives. Not in academic philosophy departments, but in what happens when someone actually starts to believe it, or even half believe it. If other people aren't real, if they're just constructs of your mind, then their suffering doesn't matter, their rights don't matter, their lives don't matter. Solipsism, taken seriously, is the ultimate justification for total moral indifference. You can't wrong someone who doesn't exist. You can't be cruel to a figment. This isn't hypothetical. There's a documented psychological phenomenon, solipsism syndrome, where individuals, often in extreme isolation, begin to lose the felt sense that the outside world and other people are real. It's been observed in astronauts, in prisoners in solitary confinement, in people immersed in virtual environments for too long. The boundary between self and world starts to dissolve, and when it does, empathy goes with it. So, no, solipsism isn't just a quirky thought experiment for philosophy undergrads to argue about over coffee. It's a live wire, a framework that, if internalized, severs the very foundation of ethics, because every moral system ever constructed, every single one, rests on the assumption that other beings are real and that their experiences matter. Solipsism pulls that rug out completely. Descartes found his way back from the edge. He used God as a bridge back to reality, back to trust in the external world. But not everyone who stares into that abyss has a bridge waiting. Some people just keep staring, and the abyss, as Nietzsche warned, stares back. Charles Darwin looked at nature and saw a mechanism: survival of the fittest, natural selection, species adapting over millennia through competition, mutation, and death. It was a biological observation, a description of how life evolves. He never meant it as a prescription for how humans should treat each other, but Herbert Spencer did. Spencer took Darwin's theory and dragged it out of biology and into society. He argued that the same laws governing the animal kingdom apply to human civilization, that competition among people, economic, social, racial, is natural, inevitable, and more than that, beneficial. The strong rise, the weak fall. And any attempt to interfere with that process, Spencer saw it as not just futile, but harmful, a violation of nature's law. This is social Darwinism, and it became one of the most weaponized ideas in modern history. Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest, not Darwin, and he used it to argue against welfare, public education, charity programs, anything that might prop up those he considered unfit. In Spencer's view, poverty wasn't a social failure, it was a biological verdict. The poor were poor because they were less capable, less evolved, and helping them only weakened the species. Now, here's what makes this idea so insidious. It takes something real, the observable fact that competition exists in nature, and twists it into a moral argument. It says, Because this is how nature works, this is how things should work. That leap from is to ought is one of the oldest logical fallacies in philosophy. David Hume identified it centuries earlier, but Spencer ignored it entirely, and millions followed him. The consequences were catastrophic. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, social Darwinism became the intellectual backbone of imperialism. European powers used it to justify the colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The logic was simple and brutal. If certain civilizations were more technologically advanced, that meant they were more fit, and the unfit civilizations, they were meant to be conquered, absorbed, or eliminated. It didn't stop at empires. Social Darwinism fed directly into the eugenics movement. Francis Galton, Darwin's own cousin, took Spencer's ideas and pushed them further. He argued that humanity could be improved through selective breeding, encourage the fit to reproduce, prevent the unfit from doing so. Forced sterilization programs spread across the United States, Scandinavia, and beyond. Tens of thousands of people, the mentally ill, the disabled, the poor, racial minorities, were sterilized against their will. And then came the most extreme application. The Nazis took social Darwinism to its logical, horrifying endpoint. Hitler explicitly invoked the language of biological fitness, racial purity, and natural selection. The Holocaust wasn't just driven by hatred. It was rationalized through a framework that Spencer had helped build, a framework that said nature demands the elimination of the weak. Darwin himself would have been appalled. He wrote about compassion as a product of evolution. He recognized that cooperation, not just competition, drives human survival. But none of that mattered once the idea was loose. Once people had a scientific excuse to justify cruelty, they didn't need Darwin's nuance. They had Spencer's simplicity. And that's the real danger. Social Darwinism doesn't survive because it's scientifically valid. It isn't. Biologists have dismantled it for over a century. It survives because it tells powerful people exactly what they want to hear: that their power is natural, that inequality is inevitable, that the suffering of others is simply the cost of progress. It's not nature's law, it's nature's excuse. Here's a thought that, once it enters your mind, is almost impossible to fully shake off, and it's been haunting philosophy for centuries: solipsism. The idea that the only thing you can be certain exists is your own mind. Everything else, the people around you, the world you see, the ground beneath your feet, it might all be a construction, a projection, a dream you're having with no way to wake up and verify what's real. And the worst part? No one has ever been able to fully refute it. René Descartes opened this door. He didn't mean to. In the 17th century, Descartes set out to find something, anything, that couldn't be doubted. He stripped away everything. The senses? They deceive us. The physical world? Could be an illusion. Other people? Can't prove they have minds. He tore it all down until he was left with one thing, one single, unshakable certainty: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But here's what Descartes didn't fully reckon with. If the only thing you can prove is that you exist as a thinking thing, then you've just built a philosophical prison, and there's no key. Descartes himself tried to escape it. He brought God back into the equation as a guarantor of reality. A benevolent God, he argued, wouldn't deceive us about the existence of the external world. But that's not a proof. That's a rescue operation. He needed a way out, so he invented one. And most philosophers since have recognized it for what it was: a patch on a crack he couldn't seal. George Berkeley took things in a different direction. He argued that material objects don't exist independently of perception. Esse est percipi.
To be is to be perceived. A tree falling in a forest with no one around doesn't just make no sound. For Berkeley, it doesn't exist. Not really. Berkeley wasn't a solipsist in the strict sense. He used God as the universal perceiver who keeps reality running, but his framework edges dangerously close. Remove God from Berkeley's system, and you're alone, completely alone. And that's the danger of solipsism. Not that anyone seriously lives by it. Almost no philosopher in history has genuinely claimed to be a solipsist. But the danger is that it's logically airtight in a way that's deeply uncomfortable. You cannot prove with absolute certainty that other minds exist. You experience your own consciousness directly. Everyone else's, you're inferring it, assuming it, taking it on faith. Ludwig Wittgenstein tried to dismantle solipsism from a different angle. He argued that language itself is inherently social, that a truly private language is impossible. And if language requires other minds, then solipsism collapses under the weight of the very words you'd use to express it. It's a clever argument, maybe the best one we have. But even Wittgenstein admitted that solipsism, when pushed to its limit, starts to merge with pure realism. It becomes a boundary you can't quite cross and can't quite retreat from.
So why does this idea belong on a list of dangerous philosophies? Because solipsism doesn't just isolate you intellectually. It dissolves the foundation for ethics, for empathy, for every human connection you've ever felt. If other minds are uncertain, then other people's suffering is uncertain. Their joy is uncertain. Their entire existence is uncertain. And a mind that truly absorbs that truly believes it, has no reason to care about anything beyond itself. It's not just a lonely thought. It's a thought that, taken seriously, makes loneliness the only possible condition of existence. In 1747, a French physician named Julien Offray de la Mettrie published a short book that detonated like a bomb across Europe. The title alone was enough to provoke outrage. L'homme machine, man a machine. La Mettrie's argument was blunt. Human beings are not special, not sacred, not touched by the divine. They are biological machines. Complex, yes, but machines nonetheless. Thought, emotion, consciousness, morality, all of it, he claims, is the product of physical processes. Organs, nerves, chemistry, nothing more. The soul, a fiction. Free will, an illusion we tell ourselves because the alternative is too uncomfortable to accept. He didn't arrive at this casually. La Mettrie was a trained physician. He'd studied the body. He'd watched fevers alter personality. He'd seen injuries to the brain destroy memory, speech, identity. And he drew the conclusion that most of his contemporaries were too afraid to draw, that the mind is not something separate from the body. It is the body. And if the mind is just matter in motion, then human beings are no different in principle from a clock. More intricate, sure, but still a mechanism, still governed by the same physical laws as everything else in the natural world. The reaction was immediate and violent. The church condemned the book. The French government banned it. La Mettrie was driven out of France, then out of the Netherlands. He eventually found refuge in the court of Frederick the Great in Prussia, one of the few places in Europe where a man could say the unsayable and not end up in a cell, or worse. But here's the thing. The backlash wasn't just theological outrage. It was fear, because La Mettrie's idea didn't just challenge religion, it challenged the entire moral order. If human beings are machines, if there's no soul, no free will, no divine spark, then on what basis do you hold anyone accountable? The murderer didn't choose to kill. His biology did. The saint didn't choose to be virtuous. His chemistry did. La Mettrie essentially argues that praise and blame are meaningless
because no one is truly in control of what they do. People are just matter reacting to stimuli. That's it. And this is where the idea gets genuinely dangerous. Not because it's necessarily false. Modern neuroscience in many ways has moved closer to Lemetry's position than most people are comfortable admitting, but because of what it does to the systems we've built on the assumption that people do have agency. Law, justice, ethics, democracy, all of it rests on the premise that individuals can choose, that they are responsible for their actions. Pull that premise out, and the whole structure starts to wobble. Lemetry himself didn't seem too troubled by the implications. He leaned into them. He argued that if humans are machines driven by pleasure and pain, then the rational thing to do is pursue pleasure without guilt. Morality, in his view, is just social conditioning, useful maybe, but not grounded in anything real. That position earned him enemies, even among fellow materialists. Diderot dismissed him. Voltaire mocked him. He was too radical even for the radicals. He died in 1751, reportedly from eating a spoiled pâté at a banquet. He was 41. And for a long time after, his work was treated more as a scandal than a serious contribution to philosophy. But the idea didn't die with him. It seeped into the foundations of modern thought: behaviorism, determinism, cognitive science. The question Lemetry forced into the open, are we anything more than what our biology makes us, hasn't gone away. It's only gotten harder to answer. Most dangerous ideas attack something outside of you, a government, a belief system, a social order. But this one goes after something much closer. It attacks the very idea that your life has a point. Albert Camus opened the myth of Sisyphus with what he called the only truly serious philosophical problem. Not justice, not freedom, suicide. Whether life is worth living, that's where he started. And the answer he arrived at wasn't comforting. It wasn't supposed to be. Camus argued that human beings are creatures who desperately need meaning. We crave purpose, narrative, a reason for being here. But the universe, the actual, cold, indifferent universe, offers none. No answers, no structure, no cosmic plan, just silence. And the collision between that human need and that universal silence, Camus called it the absurd. Not absurd like a joke, absurd like a condition, a permanent, inescapable mismatch between what we want from existence and what existence actually provides. Søren Kierkegaard had touched on this earlier, though he took it in a very different direction. Kierkegaard described the moment a person confronts the groundlessness of their existence, the dizziness, the vertigo of realizing that nothing external guarantees your choices matter. He called it anxiety. Not the clinical kind, the existential kind, the kind that hits when you realize you're free, and that freedom has no built-in instructions. But Kierkegaard's answer was faith, a leap into the religious. Camus rejected that completely. He called it philosophical suicide, a dodge, an attempt to escape the absurd by inventing a meaning that isn't really there. Religion, ideology, any grand framework that claims to resolve the tension, Camus saw them all as evasions, comfortable lies dressed up as salvation. So what's left? Camus argued that the honest response is to live with the absurd. Don't resolve it, don't escape it, face it. He used the myth of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down every time, as the image of human existence, pointless, repetitive, unending. And then Camus made his famous declaration, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." That line has been quoted endlessly, usually ripped from context and turned into something inspirational. It's not. It's defiance. Camus wasn't saying life is secretly beautiful. He was saying life is meaningless and you should keep going anyway, not because it gets better, but because surrender is the only alternative, and surrender is worse. Thomas Nagel, decades later, put it more dryly. He argued that the absurd arises from a specific human ability, the ability to step back from our own lives and see them from the outside. From that distance, everything looks arbitrary. Your career, your relationships, your values, all of it. Nagel suggested that the proper response isn't despair, it's irony. A kind of quiet, clear-eyed acknowledgement that we take our lives seriously while knowing, at some level, that the seriousness is unjustified. And here's why this idea is dangerous. Not because it's wrong, but because it's partially right, and partial truths are the hardest to survive. The absurd doesn't hand you nihilism, it hands you a choice. And most people, when they truly confront the possibility that none of this means anything, don't land on Camus' defiant acceptance. They land somewhere darker: apathy, cynicism, paralysis, the kind of quiet surrender that doesn't look like giving up, but is. Camus knew that. He warned against it. But warnings don't always work, especially when the thing you're warning about feels like the truth.